happy to be with you here because just listening to Sandy's lineup, oh my gosh, it's incredible. I mean, world-class stuff coming out of Santa Fe CIR, but of course, that's what we've learned to expect. As you know, so if you know me, I've lived many years of my life overseas, mostly as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, serving in political military capacities. Taking this time, been doing a lot of thinking about what the Biden and his team are up to. So I'm happy to share with you some thoughts about prospects for the new Biden administration and the United States and the world. So what I'm going to do, talk here for about 40 minutes, and then we'll look forward to your questions, because really there's far too much to cover to really go into specifics in this presentation, in which my goal is going to be to give you a broad overview of where we are and where we're going. But really the purpose, the intent is to kind of present a way of thinking about the complex foreign policy, national security challenges that the Biden administration is facing, and a way of thinking also about the United States in the world. There are going to be three parts to the talk here. First, sorry, can't avoid it, Donald Trump's impact. Second part, President Biden, his team, and their foreign policy vision. And yes, there is a vision. I think it's not too hard to capture. And then in the third part, I'm going to try to give some perspective, put it in a longer historical time frame, look at the same time, look beyond 2021, and sort of talk about what's old, what's new, and how those two might be interacting with each other. Bottom line for me is I think we can all share a certain amount of relief that the Biden team has entered in and is taking over quickly. Now, I'm a skeptic, but not a cynic. And I would say with some confidence that despite the destruction that has taken place over the past 4 years and the number of crises that are cooking on the world stage right now, the Biden team is off to a fairly good start, and there are actually some reasons for optimism. With that, I'm going to share the screen here. Part one, Trump. To put it, I guess, in a nutshell, we all know this was a deeply anti-constitutional president, and his leadership, although we can't really call it that, was largely a product of his deeply flawed character, which is characterized by malignant narcissism. It was, to put it in more basic terms, a hyper-politicized, hate-filled con job that culminated on January 6th. Really culminated 4 years of political trauma and lies with this big lie about the election being stolen, and then the violent, inciting the violent seizure of the Capitol building. This experience domestically is also was projected onto the world stage, and basically turned U.S. behavior, international behavior, upside down. A lot of this would be absurd, except for that it was also extremely dangerous. here we have, just to review some of the greatest hits. Here we have the love affair with Kim Jong-un, the humiliation of kowtowing to Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, the standoff with Angela Merkel and the NATO, and then the sort of the topper in some ways, that incredible first visit that wasn't to a neighbor like Mexico or Canada, or to our partner, the United Kingdom, but to Saudi Arabia. And there he is posing with two of the world's more authoritarian leaders. To put a label on the Trump foreign policy, it was characterized by incoherence, and of course unilateralism. And the best phrase that I heard to describe it was a style of belligerent nationalism. It's important to keep in mind that this wasn't just Trump, but all of his people throughout that were in the foreign policy realm. And instead of the best, as promised, we ended up with a kakistocracy. If you haven't heard that word, it's an actual word, and it means government by the worst people. As a product of all this chaos and doubt, our alliances became fractured. International organizations were weakened, basically abandonment of US international leadership. And that abandonment included either formally withdrawing from or denouncing 18 agreements, at least that's the last count I saw. As a result of this, adversaries took advantage of the American withdrawal from international leadership. And in fact, I think it's an objective, by objective measure, you can say that national security threats either grew worse or there was zero progress. And it's easy enough to go through the list, but Iran, North Korea, terrorism, despite the defeat of ISIS that was, by the way, well underway during the Obama administration, terrorism, China rising, trade wars yielded very little result. If anything, the deficit is more entrenched than ever. Of course, pandemic response botched. And that's not just in the U.S. It's the absence of the U.S. as a leader increased its intensity in the throughout the world. Same goes for climate change and other environmental issues. Nothing tells this story more than the numerous polls that tell us that world opinion of the United States reached its lowest point ever since records have been kept. And the most telling is the Pew poll that shows Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping with higher trust and reliability ratings than President Trump. Think about that. This was the greatest break in US foreign policy in 75 years. In other words, since the end of World War II, and really the liberal world order that the United States created as a result of victory in World War II, and then sustained throughout the Cold War. And what we're talking about here is the global security architecture, the range of multilateral organizations, but also an approach to interaction among nations that has important multilateral dimension. We also had attacks on the legitimacy of American foreign policy and national security institutions. All of these things cumulatively ended up having a destructive effect without actually having anything to replace it with. And that's the critical part. Instead of make America great again, America has ended up materially weaker in the world. Now, we can point to two bright spots. Trump did not have an ideology, a coherent direction, nor was he particularly militaristic. And as a result of that, one, we got lots of bluster, but we did not stumble into any major wars. So that's a bright spot, I guess you could call it that. And the other one is that the lack of direction and the sheer incompetence of this administration meant that the impact of the destructive approach to American relations was far less worse than it otherwise would have been. And just to make a side note to that, not all of the people in the Trump administration were awful. Compare those radical propagandists that were appointed to the International Broadcasting Board of Governors that promptly set out to make the United States' long record of international broadcasting into a partisan political channel. Contrast that with the head of the World Food Program, the U.S. appointed head of the World Food Program, who was an evangelical Christian, but embodied those Christian ideas and carried out his job to great credit and support from wide support from the international humanitarian community. The reason I'm pointing this out is when you hear commentators say, oh, Trump got this right, and then proceed to explain what he got right, cumulatively, that cannot possibly excuse the magnitude of damage that was done. We are really fortunate in the end that we don't have 4 more years of this to go. Okay, that's the Trump summary. And as soon as I can get mine, there we go. On to Biden. So I think that if we're looking for big themes and trying to figure out what direction, that this starting point is very important. We lead by the example of our power, not by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. And I'll expand on that as we go. Biden really is the anti-Trump. There are reasons why, if you're reading the commentary, he evokes Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And of course, it's not because we're facing civil war or we're entering World War III, but the degree of political division and the number and complexities of the challenges that the country is facing are in many ways comparable. And you don't need me really to bring out, try to explain this. There is an absolute flood of information and commentary, but it's almost unprecedented, the degree to which a couple of week-old administration is putting out information in great volumes. Not only is Joe Biden well known, so is his team. They are clear what they are about. They're serious. I don't know if you've noticed, but they speak with one voice and they mean what they say. Just look at those day one promises, all of them kept. So I think that you can use this starting point as a good marker for that. We've got rejoining Paris, rejoining the World Health Organization, and the immigration bill, which is a little bit of surprise. You know, the need for the immigration legislation is desperate. There hasn't been a bill since 1986. That's Ronald Reagan, and that's going to take an enormous amount of political courage and will to carry through on. But it is at the heart of domestic and foreign policy. Let me give you a recommendation of one thing to read, and that is Biden's essay in the March-April 2020 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, titled "Why America Must Lead Again." That's where the quote comes from. And I think what really comes out of it of interest is that Biden is a generational bridge figure. And in this sense, his age is an advantage. He comes into office as a senator at the, sort of when the last of the the last of the World War II people are still serving in office. So he is bridging from basically the Vietnam War to the end of the Cold War to the post Cold War unipolar moment, as it's called, to 9/11 to today. That's a pretty big span. No one else can really do that. And his foreign policy is very well known. It's an extension of his decades as a senator, including as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, 2 terms as vice president, in which he had major international responsibilities. And that's why it's important, I think, to pay attention. When he talks about democracy, he means it. He's serious about democracy and foreign policy. And the personal touches that he shows on the domestic side are equally applicable to international relations. So is his vision. It's not super imaginative. It's much more pragmatic. It's not particularly ideological in the sort of the ambitious sense that we've seen with some other administrations. In other words, he's basically comes into office as a statesman. And if I had to put a theme on this, it would be order from chaos. That's the task that he has taken on, and that echoes the theme of unity that he's trying to promote, and that he talked about in his inaugural address. Same goes for the team, foreign policy team. Very time to do that. So I think what we can say about his foreign policy and national security team is that, first of all, in choosing them, President Biden showed his leadership. Yes, he had a big team of people who coalesced around him and put tons of energy in, and that's really paying off now in showing how fast they're able to get the ground running. It was to his credit that he brought Kamala Harris into all of the major decisions about people, and it's pretty clear to me that he is grooming her, and he's using his role as vice president under President Obama as a model for what he sees her role to be. This is a deep bench. They tend to be on the youngish side, but they are experienced, an enormous amount of experience in some cases, and they're very much in sync. Some of them, and we're talking here 2 and 3 levels down, some of them came in with Bill Clinton and have known each other that long. And the world knows them. There's very few that don't know, most world, many, if not most world leaders. Many of them are also widely published in major newspapers and other places. Let me just mention quickly, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State. He's been with Biden since the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he was a staffer and then was the chief staffer when Biden was the chairman of Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, there on the top right. And we've also had a lot of opportunity to see him because he's basically been serving as the spokesman for the administration until the confirmations came on. He may be the most strategic and conceptual national security advisor since Vignu Brzezinski. But maybe even more important, he's also modest, authentically modest. And if you want to go look, for example, at his interviews with Fareed Zakaria on CNN last week, that comes through very clearly. That bodes well for the National Security Council as the center point for foreign policy making. Let me give you a few other observations. We're not talking here about back to the future, even though a lot of these people served in the Obama administration, including the president himself. They have already shown some very important differences, of which the most important is that we can expect the Biden administration to be much more decisive and invested in foreign policy, frankly, than the Obama administration was. They are not about recreating the world liberal order or even the Bush, George H.W. Bush vision of the new world order after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You will see in almost all of the statements a recognition that the world has changed and moved on, and they need to start and deal with the world as it is now. That said, there is an element of consistency, of restoration in the broadest sense of a foreign policy vision that they're putting out there. And here, I'm intentionally not talking about specific issues, trying to paint a broader picture. What are the elements of it? Democracy first. Support for free trade, multilateralism, a reliance on maintaining strong American military. All of these things are fundamental parts that really go back 75 years in American foreign policy. What about challenges? Keeping with the broader picture. There is a reason why political risk groups are still rating the United States itself as the greatest threat to global stability. And it's not just because of Trump. It's because of domestic political dysfunction. And this is a serious concern. As I said, Biden's unity theme applies equally to foreign policy. And of course, Congress is key as the Democrats take on the majority. There are some obvious areas for consensus that might not be too hard to get policy hammered out. Excuse me, China, cyber, what to do about cyber war and disinformation, counterterrorism, and defense in general. The Senate confirmations, although they're a little bit behind schedule, I wouldn't make too much of that. They've gone very smoothly, especially of Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, Tony Blinken, and Lloyd Austin, who you see there on the bottom left. The large centrist majorities that have approved their nominations in the full Senate is a very promising sign that there is some motivation to revert to bipartisan foreign policy. Now, of course, the other thing to watch is the immigration bill, which is first up. And I think there we're going to be diving back into the deep political, domestic political divides that are at the center of what today is being called identity politics, but really is a core issue of American values in the world. Biden foreign policy principles. Now, I'm not going to talk about each of these in turn. I'm more, if just take a look there, and I'm going to sort of talk and try to capsulize what these mean, and then go on to some specific issues. The strategic vision begins with restoring U.S. global leadership. That's why I recommended that you read the Foreign Affairs essay, Why America Must Lead Again. Now, we know that it's not going to be the same, but it is intended to project, as Tony Blinken said day before yesterday, when he entered the State Department for the first time and addressed foreign and civil service people. What he said was that we intend this to be America at its best. And that's not just sort of ideological, sort of idealistic reaching. The idea of restoring American leadership is a reasonable proposition, and it's grounded, well grounded in fact. Yes, Trump weakened the US, but what he really did was he accelerated what was really a relative decline in the context of the rise of others. And of course, you know, the focus is on China as an adversary, but the same goes for our allies and for developing countries and around the world. Just to put some quick numbers on it, in 1950, when the world was still recovering from the effects of World War II, the United States accounted for 50% of GDP. In 1990, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, that was 25%. And today it's around 15%. Still the most powerful largest economy in the world. There's an argument that the United States is overextended. Well, just to draw some comparisons, Great Britain, at the height of its empire, at the sort of, let's say, the close of the 19th century, was spending about 25% of its GDP on its army, its navy, and maintaining its colonies. By contrast, all United States international expenditures, military and non-military, are less than 5% of our GDP. Add to that the fact that we have on the order of 45 NATO and non-NATO allies. We have over 200 formal basing arrangements around the world. We have intelligence community, a diplomatic corps that are second to none, that have a global presence and access that is second to none. And the US dollar is still the single global reserve currency. These are all, like not exactly signs of American decline. So how do these foreign policy principles get translated into actual concrete priorities? And here, the administration, I mean, really, it's not even in its first month, has been very, very clear. First, domestic policy is foreign policy. And that's a very simple but often forgotten principle. A strong middle class is essential for a strong America in the world. And that means that dealing with COVID pandemic and economic recovery of the US as the top priorities are not just domestic, but they're also international priorities. Second, the most immediate task that the Biden administration faces in foreign conduct of foreign relations is restoring trust. And there they have been very clear about putting allies first and paying attention to democracies. It's very interesting. Something to keep your eye on is this proposal to hold a democracy summit in the first year of the administration. Exactly what shape that will take and what they'll try to accomplish is a big question. But it's a pretty interesting. It's a serious proposal, and I think that it does reflect the core values that we're seeing coming in. I suspected, despite all the griping after the election, that the world, by and large, is going to welcome the Biden administration. That we've already seen a fair amount of that. Biden himself and the others are all out busy making calls. The White House is getting out the record and summaries of those calls through public announcements the same day. That's very, very impressive. I suspect that especially with allies, that the response is going to be pretty fast and it's going to be okay. And the reasons are not just because they missed the United States and they like us. It's because there's nowhere else to go, because China is deeply distrusted and increasingly distrusted. So the question is, how much are other nations going to hedge as a result of Trump? Third priority in conduct of foreign policy, the demilitarization of foreign policy. It doesn't mean big declines in defense expenditures. It merely means putting diplomacy first on the recognition that diplomacy that is not backed by force does not have a lot of weight. So on more specific issues, Close, we've got the first up, the global problems of the pandemic and climate change. And there it's on climate change, very interesting. The announcement to rejoin Paris Accord combined with the appointment of John Kerry as the climate czar, really the ideal choice, because he was the one who signed the Paris Accord 6 years ago. And we've got some concrete action already out there. One is this proposal to have an Earth Day summit on April 22nd. And that is definitely taking the stage as U.S. leadership, because that will probably end up being the premier event in the run-up to the UN Glasgow summit in November, which was put off for last year, in which nations are expected to declare their global targets. Next priority is immigration. I already mentioned that, as a combination of domestic and foreign issue. Next priority, big priority, a little bit of a surprise, but we actually should have expected it, is this emphasis on arms control. And it's here that the evolution of the erosion of America in the world has really taken over, really become clear. Oops, we got a little bit of ahead of ourselves there. Sorry. I don't know quite how that happened, but hang on a sec.
It's just that kind of morning, Todd.
Now it's night for me. Okay. Going back to slideshow. Give me that slideshow. Okay, sorry. Arms control. So nowhere has been the erosion of the U.S. and the world clearer. Biden folks have a very clear strategic priority set. It is to view weapons of mass destruction as the #1 threat to the United States and the world. Seems kind of simple there, that logic. Why is this so hard? The focus of attention has largely been on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That's the Iran nuclear deal, where the U.S. has widely signaled, and where, you know, I'd love to get a back channel read on what's going on there. But we've also got, you know, North Korea hanging, that has absolutely, you know, despite the love affair, has absolutely that happened again. I don't understand what's going on. That has absolutely increased its missile and nuclear capability in an extremely dangerous way. Most interesting, though, actually, was putting the New START, that's the ballistic missile treaty with Russia, the one remaining arms control agreement that was going to expire in February, put that on an equal footing with the Iran agreement. And here there's a big Cold War lesson that is we can see it in application. And yes, there is enormous friction with Russia, you know, in which basically we see their world role as a disruptor. They both put an emphasis on extension of START, so that New START negotiations can start taking place. That leads up to China, of course, in which I think the starting point is everybody's come to the realization that abandon the naive assumption that China would become a responsible player in the liberal world order. So I'm not going to go into details about the nature of the challenge that China presents to the United States, but we'll make a couple points. One, it's not the Cold War, and there's some, you know, that's the talk right now. If you look at Angela Merkel's statement in her at Davos with Xi about both of them wanting to avoid a Cold War with China. I think that's the big theme there. But look at there are fundamental differences also. The world is not divided into power-locked territorial blocks. As a result of globalization, the United States and the rest of the world are much more intertwined with China than anything that ever occurred under the Soviet era. And also, perhaps most importantly, China is a hell of a lot stronger, has a lot more basic raw power and potential for growth than the Soviet Union ever did. Big lesson of history here. Fear of the rising power is more often than not a matter of has led to war. So that's the big issue. That is the big thing so managing China's rise as a matter of relations between the US and China, as much as anything else, is about preventing something from happening, not what you're going to accomplish. At the same time, there's been a very, very clear start and a clear signaling on the part of the Biden administration. Right now, the Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group is going through the South China Sea on a freedom of navigation operation. China did not put ships in front of it. It's got ships following. That is a pretty powerful signal. But at the same time, it was not just an in-the-air military operation. It was combined with a very clear policy message, which was the United States will oppose any unilateral attempt to change the status quo in Asia Pacific. And that's a very powerful message to China, but it's also, if reading between the lines, a signal that the United States is not going to continue down the path, this very dangerous path that the Trump administration was doing of trying to upgrade relations with Taiwan and violate the two China policy. The common theme, you can draw a common theme out of these big issues in great power competition. And that is, from the Biden perspective, it's a matter of balancing cooperation and confrontation. And the ability to do that, in other words, to cooperate with the other great powers, even while you're confronting them, is also critically important to managing and resolving the economic, the pandemic, and the climate crises that we're facing at the same time. Okay, I'm going to say a few words about defense. And then continue the conversation. The Biden team is been identified as defense hawks by the Democratic progressives. But what does that mean? It really means that they have embodied through experience and crisis this notion of, if you want peace, prepare for war. I think that's in an overall general sense, a way of characterizing the approach to military and defense issues. At the same time, recognizing that there is no appetite whatsoever for the US to play global policeman anymore. Although, let me say, this notion of forever wars, and we can talk about this some more if you want, it's a total strategic fallacy. It's just a bumper sticker. But there are on the order of 10 major global conflicts underway right now. the US is a direct or an indirect participant in all of them. So figuring out what the US role is going to be is a critical task underway. I'm not going to say any more about that. We could go on, but there's that slide. Okay, but let me conclude with a few words about cooperation and confrontation in the Anthropocene. Of course, the Anthropocene refers to the idea that we are in the new equivalent of a geological age in which human presence on Earth is the most important impact on climate and all life on the planet. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this fundamentally changes the framework for understanding relations between nations, which up until now, not just in the modern era, but going back millennia, in which the space, sort of Earth, is defined as political space, which human groups are engaged essentially in a struggle for power and control over territory, over people, over resources. And that in doing that, interactions between states basically consist at the extremes in fighting or trading. In the parlance, matters of war and peace are usually referred to as high policy, and matters such as immigration, the environment, and health are referred to as low policy. Well, today in the Anthropocene, that order has been reversed. The high policy issues are exactly those issues of the economy in terms of globalization, whether or not the sort of the capitalistic proposition of emphasizing growth over equity and sustainability is something that's going to be able to continue. And of course, the idea that that confrontation is not a viable way of resolving any of these global issues. Cooperation is absolutely essential. And from that point of view, there's a very interesting precedent. We can make that a bit of a New Mexico story, in that some people, in referring to the Anthropocene, date its origin to the 1945 Trinity test of the first nuclear device, which ultimately signaled the ability through destructive power, through confrontation, to destroy not just humanity, but all life on Earth. A couple of other points related to this. Right now, we're undergoing a revolutionary transformation, sort of like the future is now. But this is really the culminating point of an incredible era of human progress. And these slides illustrate this very well. Look at the growth of human population, the increase in life expectancy, and the increase in GDP per capita. All of these are incredible measures of progress, which in themselves are the results of increasing control of the environment and really human decision making. So the problem with this, the problem that is directly relevant to the conduct of foreign policy and transfer, what I think is going to be a very important transformation in the nature of relations, has to do with the fact that this progress is also the source of great complexity and of danger. And the best illustration to that is part of the progress we can point to the decline in state-to-state war since World War II, and then look at US battle deaths. So Vietnam, there were 58,000 Americans killed in action. Since Vietnam, that number is less than 8,000 in all wars combined. But that doesn't make sense standing on its own without recognizing the huge asymmetry of America's destructive power. And there, if you look at global casualties as a result of wars in which America was either directly involved or was a major supplier or indirect participant, those battle deaths go into the hundreds of thousands, if not surpassing a million. Okay, now if you want to, so I know this is getting into sort of maybe big think stuff rather than specific foreign policy issues, but in a way it's an introduction and an advertisement for listening to Brad Allenby, who's going to be all about this stuff on February 10th. Okay, quick point. Basically what we're talking about here, the Trump administration's worldview was fundamentally backward looking. The Biden administration is fundamentally forward looking. And really it's in that sense, I think we can expect to see, while grounded in some fundamental practices that have existed for the past 75 years, also an interest and a willingness to adapt. Maybe, Sandy, should I stop there, go to questions?
Yeah, why don't we do that? There's a bunch of questions here. I know we'll probably pick up on some of the things you're talking about. Can we go, there's a number of questions here around the Middle East, and I thought we might dive in with a question from George Duncan about the Abraham Accords, which is normalizing relations between the UAE and Israel. How important are those accords, and should President Trump be given full credit for that?
Yeah, I'm not such a big fan of all that. A lot of this was, okay. Sorry, couldn't get the stop share screen to come up. A lot of it was already underway. And I think that the primary credit of this goes to MBZ in the UAE as playing power broker, and his partnership with MBS in Saudi Arabia. That to the extent that the United States has done anything, we've been enablers of what was almost inevitable in the aligned security interest of Israel and the Gulf Arab states in confronting Iran. And unfortunately, this has been done without sort of any stops or blocks in place. And that's, I would expect from the Biden administration, that we're going to see a lot of revisiting of that. And not that this does not represent a significant evolution.
What about, one of the huge Trump administration claims for success was relocating the U.S. embassy from or to Jerusalem. What are the implications of that, do you think, for the Biden administration? How important is it, let's say, in terms of the worldview that the U.S. will be pursuing now?
I think it's less important than people think. The Biden administration has indicated no intent to try to reverse that. The fact that it's largely been accepted as a fait accompli in the Arab world, it does not signal in and of itself a permanent expansion of Israeli interest. So where, although that was clearly its intent, sort of an anything for Netanyahu leaning. But there's a lot of interest in President Biden himself and his team. I would expect to see maybe, when things settle down, assuming they will, a revival of interest in the Middle East peace. And here, there's a logic to it. It's how is it possible that Israel somehow or other has not been able to grasp that its permanent security is fundamentally related to resolution of its relations with Palestine. And living here in Jordan, of course, which is the country that has the most refugees of all the countries in the world, this is an everyday reality. But I would definitely expect something, maybe later rather than sooner, but something to come out of Washington.
Let's hop across the continent to North Korea. There's a couple questions here. One from Herb Thomas. Trump's approach to Kim Jong-un was admittedly backwards. Principals meeting without the working level folks doing the preliminary work. But because it was personality driven, it achieved de-escalation in attitudes, if not materially. Is this an achievement that conventional diplomacy could not have achieved? And then a second question, given that North Korea always makes a big huss and fuss with a new U.S. administration, what can we kind of expect from North Korea or from Biden's approach to North Korea?
Oh my gosh, yeah, this is what I was talking about. That so much of what Trump did was basically a showmanship con job. There were no benefits whatsoever from meeting with Kim Jong-un, other than Kim Jong-un getting major legitimacy for his leadership inside North Korea. This was a huge mistake. I'm not just talking out of my hat here. Look at the increase in ballistic missile and nuclear capability that North Korea has achieved in the past 4 years. The issue that I think the issue in the first place that the Biden administration will have to resolve in some way, assuming that there is no immediate provocation or crisis, is whether or not the policy that's been pursued for the past decades of attempting to get North Korea to relinquish its weapons of mass destruction is viable. Or whether you start with the assumption that they're never going to relinquish them, and therefore you have to prepare for some other kind of outcome. And I suspect actually that we're going to see a debate about that. Maybe in the form of a formal policy review or something in Congress. But I do not see, one thing that I see as a positive sign is nobody's talking about North Korea with their hair on fire at this point.
Yeah, at this point. So 2 more questions, and I think we'll bring our conversation to a close. The first one is, given the stated intention among Biden administration officials to put human rights back at the forefront of American foreign policy abroad, or as an underpinning of foreign policy abroad, question from Steve Shore: how does this affect U.S. treatment of and relations with India, given what they've been doing to persecute their Muslim minority?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. So although we like to, always put, when we talk about India, we say world's largest democracy, and America, world's oldest democracy, and the two are somehow or other aligned. We have never really aligned with India, and we're going all the way back to Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy administrations on this sort of well, we should be closer to India somehow or other, but it never quite works out. Now something very, very different is going on. The BJP party in India under Modi's leadership is really part of a movement, the RSS, which is a Hindu nationalist movement that's been around since the 1920s. Although they are operating within a democracy, this is a sectarian and fundamentally anti-democratic movement that's in power, but they just have this, this nation that's a little bit too big to get their arms around and control in that way. So I think that it will be very interesting to see how the Biden administration combines not just the human rights dimension, but the fact that in the same way that we had in the early 70s, Nixon going to China as a fundamental offset, strategic offset to the Soviet Union, that India as an offset partner to the United States is pretty much indispensable.
Last question, Todd, is really about the U.S. Foreign Service. And this is a question from Lou Gavioli. The Foreign Service historically has been apolitical and represented what's best for Trump, for America and its allies. Of course, Trump changed all that. How does Biden restore the Foreign Service? How do we ensure, the next generation of diplomats keep coming along and are not frightened away by, U.S. Power abroad being used in ways that may not align with our own individual ideals and priorities?
So yeah, because of the political nature, not of the Foreign Service, but of the role of the State Department in conducting the politics of American nation, politics of America in the world, very different from the defense and the intelligence community in that way. It's more subject, the professional corps, diplomatic corps is more subject to political interference. But like the rest of the foreign policy and national security institutions, I think people kind of got on with their jobs, kept their heads down when necessary, and got on with their jobs as best they could. I was very encouraged to see a young woman that I'm mentoring. I've mentored junior foreign service officers for a long time. The one who's in the current class, she just graduated, Korean American, in her late 20s, absolutely enthusiastic, ready to serve, and just no hesitation. And through her, some of the other colleagues that I've heard, the numbers of people signing up for the test to take the test have gone up. I don't know if people were aware, but about sort of 1 out of 100 pass the Foreign Service exam. It's very, very hard, but the numbers taking the test in the past 4 years have just fallen off the cliff, and that's coming back up. I don't think it's going to be a hard sell at all to revive the career Foreign Service. In fact, it's going to come out of this stronger.
Yeah. Well, let's certainly hope so. Well, Todd, always a wonderful pleasure having you debunk and talk about all the major issues going on in the world today. We'll, of course, be featuring Todd as part of our Great Decisions series, where we'll be talking about Persian Gulf security. Maybe we'll get you, on the Persian Gulf itself.
Yeah, no plans at the moment, since Dubai closed down with their COVID thing. But as soon as it comes back up, let's see. I'll broadcast from the Intercontinental there on the Persian Gulf shore.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Todd. And thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you on Tuesday, I hope, where we get into the cascade of violence issues. It's going to be fascinating. Thank you, Todd, once again. Thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye, all. Thank you.